It began as a rumor and ended as a tidal truth. For months we had lived behind the concrete teeth of the Atlantic Wall, bunkers dug into cliff and beach, anti-tank obstacles like iron hedgehogs and wooden stakes, lines of barbed wire and minefields. We had been told that the coast was secure, that our steel and concrete could hold back any seaborne assault. The sea was a boundary we had learned to watch like a jealous god. From the observation posts, the channel looked peaceful, a sheet of gray glass, and in that deceptive calm our lives had been keyed to routines, repairs, drills, ration distributions, the endless maintenance that keeps fortifications breathing. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, those routines unraveled into something else. At first light we heard the roar from the sky, thousands of aircraft. The noise was not the familiar rhythm of a recognition patrol, but a vast machine, transport aircraft pouring out paratroopers, fighter sweeps that reached low and fast, and the heavy drone of bombers. Then the sea itself seemed to rise, not with waves, but with steel hulls, a small armada at first, then a fleet. The Allies had crossed the channel in a force the likes of which no man among us had seen in his life. The armada that struck Normandy included almost 7,000 vessels, warships, landing craft, merchantmen, and specialized craft, supporting an amphibious armada and airborne assault that was extraordinary in scale. Nearly 160,000 men would come ashore that day, and the sky above was crowded with aircraft to carry and to protect them. That morning, standing in a shell-scarred observation slit or in the staff tent at regimental headquarters, the reaction was the same: disbelief, followed by a fierce sharpening of the mind. We had been warned of an invasion and had long practiced for one, but the Allies had done something else besides land. They had made it inevitable. There were whispers that Rommel had been right. An attempt to break us on the beaches could not be permitted. Yet even Rommel's urgency had limits. Our defenses were real, but they were designed for attrition and delay, not to stop such a mammoth concentration without the immediate arrival and decisive use of our mobile armored reserves. Our chain of command added to the strain. Ostensibly, all forces in the West answered to Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. In practice, authority was tangled. Erwin Rommel, charged with strengthening the coastal fortifications and planning the immediate defense of the shore, argued that the armored divisions must be close, sitting under the guns so they could be hurled into counterattack the instant the enemy tried to move inland. Others, including some staff officers and the armor experts, worried that placing tanks within the range of Allied naval gunfire and air attack would bleed them away before they could strike decisively. The debate had long simmered, but when the invasion began, the matter of the armored reserves was critical and ultimately governed by a decision that would seal our early fate.
The reality was that our panzer forces were a dozen leagued answers waiting in the wings, some divisions forming Panzer Group West, others in General Reserve. They were competent units and their crews were tough men, but they were not in every sector. And Hitler had personally fixed the final disposition of many of the mobile divisions. Several panzer divisions were held as strategic reserves under higher authority rather than being placed under local commanders' immediate control. That meant that when the first Allied landings were reported, we did not have the simple right to swing every armored fist immediately onto the beaches. Requests had to wind their way up and down a chain that, in a crisis, could be lethally slow. So the opening hours were a test of nerve and wiring. Our coastal batteries, from heavy coast guns in concrete casements to lighter field pieces defended by infantry, fired with grim competence. The naval bombardment that had preceded the landing had been heavy, but it had not silenced every battery. In many sectors, shells from our guns slapped into landing craft. In others, the ships were too far or too well screened behind smoke. The landing beaches were an ugly, noisy calculus of fire and foam. Men in landing craft were cut down in the open, else they struggled through surf and wire, and when they reached the sand, they ran for the dunes and for hedgerow country shelter beyond. We were astonished by two things at once: the sheer scale of the invasion and the degree to which the air above the channel was Allied. The Luftwaffe was present in the theater, but Allied air supremacy constrained our freedom to move men and machines in daylight. When the Panzer Group West staff began to gather and plan a counterattack, their headquarters was not safe. On the 10th of June, a British raid struck the chateau at Lecaen, where Panzer Group West had established itself. The strike wounded General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg and destroyed staff and communications. That blow cost us precious hours and knocked the center out of a counterattack that might otherwise have come sooner. We were not without skill or courage. Our coastal divisions were often composed of seasoned cadres, local troops, and men who knew the country. The paratroop and Fallschirmjäger units fought like cornered wolves, and the artillerymen, those who had to face the sea, loaded guns amid bombardment with a calm that seemed almost impossible. Under orders, units counterattacked where it was possible. Small armored thrusts and Panzer Grenadier counterstrokes hit the edges of the beachheads in the days following D-Day. Sometimes they threw the Allies back for yards, sometimes for kilometers, but the pattern was set. Allies would keep coming in greater numbers, their air and naval power enabling movement and resupply at a tempo our command and communication struggled to match.
From a German staff officer's desk, the confusion read like a map of compromise. Rundstedt would draft appeals for local withdrawals or maneuver to shorten lines. Rommel would insist on immediate counterpunches to smash the lodgment on the beaches before it could expand. Above all of them, Hitler, distant and absolute, kept the strategic reserves under his own control and demanded that counterattacks must not risk the annihilation of his limited armored forces unless he authorized it. In practice, that meant that orders that needed a single urgent signature sometimes took long enough to arrive that the moment had passed. The Allies exploited that calculus with a relentlessness that wore our reactions down. There were moments of grim private clarity among front-line commanders. A company commander, watching men fall into the surf, might write in his mind of the terrible arithmetic of modern war. Air, sea, and mobile force in combination could overwhelm static defenses. Another, a battery commander whose forward observation post still functioned beneath shrapnel, would speak of the panic of seeing troop ships crossing a horizon and knowing how little time a message had before the first landing craft would be grinding ashore. These were the human micro-stresses beneath the operational calculations. In some sectors our response was brisk. On the British beaches, many of the obstacles had been laid out precisely to catch invading craft, and our gunners and machine gunners punished exposed troops as they tried to climb the upper slopes. At Omaha, American troops met with especially deadly resistance and suffered terrible casualties before a combination of small unit leadership and brute force gained a tenuous foothold. The fighting there, to our grim satisfaction, was costly for the attackers. Yet they had numbers, and each landing brought fresh units and fresh supplies, and the weight of the Allied logistic machine began to tilt the field inexorably. Another source of German astonishment was the complexity of Allied invention. Mulberry harbours, prefabricated, floating artificial ports, were not something we had fully imagined in operational practice. The Allies worked to create supply nodes where no ports existed. Once those were in place, the invasion force could be rapidly resupplied irrespective of German control of the real ports. The British armoured engineer units, Hobart's funnies with their modified tanks for mine clearing, bridge laying and obstacle removal, also caught us by surprise. Their little machines turned impediments into lanes and reduced the potency of some of our fixed defences. The creativity of Allied engineering and logistics, supported by overwhelming air and naval cover, allowed men who had been stymied on a sandbank to be reinforced overnight.
At headquarters, there were technical arguments about the relative merits of keeping the panzers centralized or dispersing them in readiness at the coast. Rommel had insisted that the best defense was to strike at the landing forces when they were still exposed on the beaches. His philosophy was of immediate local counterattack. Others argued that such units should be held back until the exact main landing site was known, and that movement in daylight could be torn apart by Allied air power. The truth, which killed many debates, was that Allied air supremacy, Allied naval fire, and the deception plans had conspired so that any decision whether to move or wait could be critiqued and often would prove costly whichever path was chosen. That dilemma is part of why, from the German side, the first week in Normandy felt like trying to move chess pieces on a board while the lights kept going out.
Then there was the matter of the airborne landings. They were terrifyingly precise in places and confused in others. In the darkness and fog before dawn, airborne troops, American and British and Polish glider forces, fell into hedgerow country and fields and trees. Some landed among our units and were cut to pieces. Others landed behind the beaches and captured bridges and choke points, cutting our communications and isolation lines. In several locations, the arrival of Allied airborne units sealed German units into pockets or prevented the rapid movement of reserves. For commanders who relied on telephone lines and radio, the sudden appearance of enemy gliders and paratroops behind their lines was a nightmare of split decisions and hurried counterattacks. And yet the German soldier on the ground did what he always had. He fought. The Bocage country transformed small unit tactics into bruising close-quarters warfare. The Allies would learn slowly how to punch through those green walls, and we would learn in return an ugly craft of delaying actions, counterattacks, and scorched earth. The fighting after D-Day was not simply a matter of beaches and ships. It became the grind of ground combat. And here our discipline and local knowledge were again useful, if ultimately insufficient against the Allied advantages in air, artillery, and reinforcements. By mid-June, the picture had locked into a different tempo. Allied logistics began to operate with increasing fluidity. Our counterattacks, slammed together from hurriedly gathered units, could win tactical victories, but could not roll back the strategic tide. When the Panzer Group West's operational headquarters was struck at Lacaine, its staff casualties and command dislocation made the planned counterblows falter. Where plans were made, they often came too late or without the cohesion necessary to break through the beachhead. The Allies pushed inland, and we were forced to fight in an ever-shortening ring of choices. There were smaller, quieter tragedies that morning and in the days after. The radio operator who could not find frequencies through smoke and jamming. There were displays of gallantry that had nothing to do with grand strategy. A platoon leader who, seeing a crater full of wounded, waded into the water under shell fire to haul men out. A coastal battery chief who, his legs trembling, refused to abandon his gun until a direct hit shattered his emplacement. But Caen was not seized quickly, and it became a grinding theater of attrition. Elsewhere, the Allies made a fist and burst it. By late July and August, their breakout operations, in combination with broader strategic pressures, stretched our divisions to breaking. Operation Cobra and the Allied push then unstitched the German front and forced rapid, costly withdrawals. The summer and autumn that followed D-Day brought some of the hardest fighting of the war for German units in the West, and a retreat that in the end could not be halted. Looking back from that bitter end, German officers would write in reports of confusion, of misplaced expectations, of the crushing confluence of Allied sea, air, and logistical power. It revealed the limits of fortification when confronted by industrialized combined arms, the consequences of a rigid command structure that places decisive resources beyond local control, and the moral and material costs of a fight for which the West had marshaled overwhelming weight.